Well, hello and welcome along to week 11 of the Talk About Doubts online course. And at the last few weeks, we've been looking at alleged discrepancies and variations between the gospel accounts, between Acts and the letters of Paul. And this evening, we're going to be looking at historical objections to the gospels. So that is alleged discrepancies between the gospels and external secular sources. So let's begin with, I'm going to survey examples of these in all four of the Gospels, beginning with the Gospel of Mark. So let's just summarize a few of the objections that you might encounter to the Gospel of Mark. So I've put these into two categories, namely geographical errors and cultural errors. So let's list, first of all, the geographical errors or supposed errors in Mark. So number one, Mark is mistaken about the geography around the Sea of Galilee. Number two, Mark is mistaken about the geography of the coast of Palestine. Third, Mark is confused about the relation between Judea and the Jordan River. And fourth, Mark gets the location of Bethphage and Bethany wrong. And then as for cultural errors, first, Mark is mistaken about the Jewish custom of hand washing. Mark is mistaken about the Jewish law of divorce. And Mark's description of Jesus' trial before the Sanhedrin is in contradiction to Jewish law. So let's look at these in turn, beginning with the geographical blunders. Okay, so let's look at Mark chapter 5, verse 1 to 13, which is our first example. So we read, "They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes." And then, of course, this is where Jesus heals a demoniac and he casts the demons from this individual into a herd of pigs, and the herd of pigs run down a steep bank into the sea and are drowned. And it says the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and they were drowned in the sea. So the objection then is that Gerasa is not on the other side of the sea. It's located far south of the Sea of Galilee, and the swine would have had to run some 37 miles before falling exhausted into the sea. And so has Mark here just blundered about the geography of Palestine? It's even worse though, because in Matthew 8:28 we read, when he came to the other side of the country of the Gadarenes. And so the place there in Matthew is different from the place name in Mark. Matthew places the event in Gadara, not in Gerasa, as Mark did. But Gadara is still 7 miles away from the Sea of Galilee. So what's going on? Well, let's check the text a little more closely. There are several significant variants in the Greek text of Mark 5, verse 1, and the parallel text in Matthew 8:28 and Luke 8:26 and 27. Now, in Mark and Luke, the best attested reading is Gerasenes, an attempt to represent the adjective corresponding to the place name. The Aramaic version of the place name would be written without vowels, because there are no vowels in Hebrew and Aramaic, as GRS or KRS. And the place name in Greek was probably originally a transliteration of the Aramaic name. That's the way that proper nouns are usually brought from one language into another. And so let's look at a map. So the identification of the region of the Gerasenes in Mark with Gerasa, or modern-day Jerish, is doubtful for the reasons that we just discussed. A plausible identification, though, is with Kyrsa, or modern Kyrsi, that you can see on the map over here on the eastern shore, where a steep hill runs then almost directly into the water. So here's the photograph of the hillside at Kyrsi. You can see there is, in fact, a steep bank running into the sea. Here's another view, and still another one. And so this, I think, is a more plausible understanding of where these events took place. But what about the Gadarenes in Matthew? Well, it seems probable that some early copies of Matthew's gospel either misspelled the term Gerasenes or mistook it for Gadarenes, much as someone might mistake or mistakenly correct Ostimo for Ostigo. The copyists of manuscripts are not immune to making errors of spelling or to fixing what they are copying if they think it is a spelling mistake. So let's look at a second objection then to the Gospel of Mark. This is in Mark 7:31. It says that Jesus returned from the region of Tyre, and and went through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. Now, this presents us with an interesting problem, because why would anyone go north in order to go south? So Jesus starts off here in Tyre, he goes up through Sidon in order to get down here to the Sea of Galilee. So how are we to make sense of this? Indeed, some critical scholars argue that this shows the evangelist was not directly acquainted with Palestine. Now, one possible reply might be that perhaps Jesus just had a specific reason for wanting to visit Sidon before going back to Galilee. The narrative simply doesn't tell us. And that, of course, would be a fair response, but I think we can do better than that. If you look at let's consult a if we look at a topographical map, we discover that there is a mountain called Mount Meron. It's 3/4 of a mile high, directly between Tyre and the Sea of Galilee. And there's actually a pass from Sidon through the mountains to the Jordan River Valley, where foot travelers to Galilee could have fresh water for the journey. And so instead of showing Mark's ignorance of the geography of this region, it actually shows his intimate familiarity with with both the geography and the topography of ancient Palestine. A third objection in Mark is in Mark 10, verse 1, where it says that Jesus left there and went to the region of Judea and beyond the Jordan. Now, the Jordan River is the eastern boundary of Judea. So did Mark just say that Jesus, coming from Capernaum, would have crossed the Jordan to go to Judea? Well, let's read the verse again. It says he left there and went to the region of Judea and beyond the Jordan. So Jesus went from Capernaum in the region of Galilee to the region of Judea and then across the Jordan to the place where John the Baptist used to baptize people. Compare John 10, verse 40. He went away again across the Jordan to the place where John had been baptizing at first. Let's look at a fourth objection, this pertaining to Mark 10, verse 1. When they drew near to Jerusalem, to Bethphage and Bethany at the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 of his disciples. Now, does Mark give the wrong order of Bethphage and Bethany for someone traveling from Jericho to Jerusalem? Here's a quote from Randall Helms in his book, who wrote the Gospels. He says that anyone approaching Jerusalem from Jericho would come first to Bethany and then Bethphage, not the reverse. This is one of several passages showing that Mark knew little about Palestine. We must assume, Dennis Niemeyer argues, that Mark did not know the relative positions of these 2 villages in the Jericho road. So how might we respond to this then? Well, let's look at the text again. When they drew near to Jerusalem, to Bethphage and Bethany, the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent 2 of his disciples. And Mark does not say, when they drew near to Jerusalem, they came first to Bethphage, then to Bethany. He is simply telling his readers approximately where it was on the road that Jesus sent his disciples on ahead. Bethphage and Bethany were both on the eastern slopes of the Mount of Olives, about a half mile from one another. So again, this is not a particularly strong objection to the Gospel of Mark. Let's then turn to a few alleged cultural blunders in Mark. So here's one from Mark 7, verse 3. Bart Ehrman, everyone's favorite New Testament scholar, says Mark 7:3 indicates that the Pharisees and all the Jews washed their hands before eating so as to observe the tradition of the elders. This is not true. Most Jews did not engage in this ritual. Now, what is the evidence that Mark is actually wrong on this point? Well, in Exodus 30, in Exodus 40, in Leviticus 20, the priests are called to observe hand-washing practices, but the people in general are not. But we can nonetheless still ask, well, did the Jews of Jesus' time, who were heavily influenced by the Pharisees, engage in the practice, even though the written law didn't require it of them? Well, let's consult some Jewish evidence. So this is from the letter of Aristeas, from dating to around 200 BC. And it says, and as is the custom of all the Jews, they washed their hands in the sea and prayed to God. Also, Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish philosopher who was a contemporary of Jesus himself, says the law does not look upon those who have even touched a dead body, which is met with a natural death, as pure and clean, until they have washed and purified themselves with sprinklings and ablutions. Let's consult a modern scholarly opinion from Susan Haber. We read, the centrality of impurity to Jewish life in the Second Temple period is supported by archaeological evidence. The discovery of mikvot in such diverse places as Gamla, Sepphoris, Herodium, and Masada suggests that in Palestine, the removal of impurity was not a right reserved only for approaching the sacred precincts of the temple, but was common practice for Jews of all walks of life. The textual evidence suggests that the Jews of the diaspora also purified themselves, if not through immersion, then by sprinkling, splashing, or hand washing. So Bart Ehrman is simply incorrect on this particular point. Let's look at a second objection. In Mark 10, verse 12, Jesus has just been giving teaching on divorce and remarriage, and the disciples in the house take him aside to ask him again about this matter. And he says, if a man divorces his wife and marries another, he commits adultery against his wife. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. Now, this gives rise to an objection because Jewish law made provision for a man to divorce his wife, but not for a woman to divorce her husband. So one critical question that's sometimes asked is, was Mark a Gentile who's here betraying his ignorance of Jewish law? Or is he deliberately fudging Jesus' teaching to make it suitable or relevant for a Roman audience where a woman could initiate divorce proceedings? Well, here's a critic stating the objection. This is from John Donahue and Daniel Harrington in their commentary on the Gospel of Mark. They write, and I quote, "The sentence is generally regarded as an addition to Jesus' teaching that was made to address situations related to Roman legal practice whereby a woman could initiate divorce proceedings." Well, how do we respond to this then? Well, we can turn to the first century Jewish historian Flavius Josephus in his Antiquities of the Jews, and he tells us that Herodias, who was the wife of Philip, Herod Antipas's brother, took it upon herself to confound the laws of her country. And he tells us that she divorced her first husband, namely Philip, Herod's brother, in order to marry Herod Antipas. So then that makes sense because Jesus was giving teaching that was relevant to his contemporary situation. And just around that time, that was when Herodias divorced her previous husband, Philip, in order to marry Herod Antipas. And of course, Herod Antipas was Tetrarch of Galilee, and Jesus has just been ministering to a crowd in Galilee. Let's look at a third objection. In the description of Jesus' trial, there are several points that have been claimed to violate Jewish law. The Sanhedrin were forbidden to hold trials at night. The Sanhedrin could hold trials only in the temple. The Sanhedrin could not hold trials during Passover. There was no 24-hour waiting period before the sentencing. The charge of blasphemy is anachronistic. Jesus' response would not have seemed blasphemous, since claiming to be the Messiah would not be seen as claiming to be God. So how do we respond to this? Well, as I said, the trial, according to the Gospels, is held at night, not in the temple during Passover, and without a 24-hour waiting period between the trial and the sentencing. Now, all of these points show is that the trial of Jesus, if it was intended as a capital trial and was not just a fishing expedition for a pretext to hand him over to the Romans, was highly irregular. But the Jewish leaders did not always follow either their own rules or Roman rules when it came to killing people. As for the question of blasphemy, E.P. Sanders argues on the basis of Sanhedrin 7:5 that the description of Jesus' words before Caiaphas cannot be authentic, for it would not have been understood as blasphemy by the Jews at the time unless Jesus uttered the divine name. But let's look carefully at the text in Mark 14. We read, again, the high priest asked him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" And Jesus said, "I am." So there's the claim to be the Messiah, which would not have been considered blasphemy. It wasn't blasphemous to claim to be the Messiah. But notice what Jesus goes on to say next. "And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." And the high priest tore his garments and said, "What further witnesses do we need? You have heard his blasphemy. What is your decision?" And they all condemned him as deserving death. Now, in the Jewish context of the first century, the phrase Son of Man would be understood as an description of divinity. In fact, even Bart Ehrman agrees with this. If you read his textbook on the New Testament, which is the title is The New Testament Historical Introduction to the Early Church Writings. It's used in colleges, universities all around the country. The first century Jewish writer of Alexandria treats any personal assumption of the prerogatives or nature of God as blasphemy, furthermore. So if you look at Daniel 7:13, the Son of Man figure, or the one like a Son of Man, is afforded in the Aramaic text Pelach. In the Greek text, the Greek Septuagint text, he's given latrebo, which is the highest form of religious service and worship, a type that's only ascribed to a deity. And he also is described with the very same language as the God of Daniel is described in Daniel 6:26 by Darius after Daniel is delivered from the lion's den. And he's also described as one who rides the clouds. So the Son of Man comes on the clouds, just as Yahweh is said to ride the clouds in various texts in the Old Testament, Psalm 104:3, Isaiah 19:1, and various other texts. And so cumulatively, it seems to me to be quite indicative that the Son of Man is a divine person. And so to claim to be the Son of Man wasn't merely to assert oneself to be the Messiah, but was more than that, to assert oneself to have divine status in some sense. So let's consult a couple of scholarly opinions. So this is from Craig Evans. He says, what made his reply a scandalous blasphemy lay in the combination of the phrases from Psalm 110 and Daniel 7. This is from Darrell Bach, who says, what is emerging is a developing consensus that the key to the blasphemy resides not in the mere use of a title, but in the juxtaposition of Psalm 110:1 with Daniel 7:13 to apply to a human figure, an unusually high level of heavenly authority. Now let's turn our attention to the case against Matthew. So first objection is to Matthew chapter 2. So the story of the slaughter of the innocents in Bethlehem is found in no other gospel. It's also unmentioned in the works of Josephus, who gives a very lengthy and detailed account of the life and death of Herod the Great. Now, how much weight, though, should we assign to the argument from silence in determining what the historicity of an event like the slaughter of the innocents? Another example that's sometimes given is in Matthew 27, when the saints that were buried and dead rose up and got out of their tombs after Jesus' death and appeared to various people in Jerusalem. We, of course, don't know exactly how many people there were, and it may have been people who died recently, and they met with relatives and friends who'd known them or something like that. We don't really have a lot of information on it, but the argument from silence also comes up in relation to those cases, and so it's incumbent upon us to determine, okay, how much weight should be given to arguments from silence of this nature, the fact that no one else appears to have written about it. Well, the argument from silence, I would argue, is a particularly weak form of argument, and there's a number of reasons for this. One is that most of the literature from Palestine in the first century has been lost, so even if someone else wrote about this event, there's little reason to necessarily think that we'd still have the work, right? So it's not particularly probable, antecedently, that we'd still have the work, even if someone had in fact written about it. And also, Bethlehem was an obscure village, and probably no more than a dozen children were killed. It wasn't an event of civic or military importance, and so there is no particular reason to think that Josephus would record it if he were aware of it. He tended to focus on events of civic or military importance, and he had many other things to write about in regards to the atrocities perpetrated by Herod the Great. Now, another point that you can make here is that when we calibrate our expectations by consulting other ancient sources, we find that there are many examples where there's an event that you might expect to be in this or that source, but it's not reported there. And so it turns out that our expectations of what an author would have written about are often quite unreliable. So, for example, Josephus and Philo both pass over the expulsion of the Jews from Rome by Claudius in silence. So it's mentioned by the 2nd century Roman historian Suetonius. We just have one passing mention of the event in the 1st century, and that's actually in the book of Acts in chapter 18, verse 2. But despite Josephus' silence, all historians acknowledge the event took place. Furthermore, No first-century source we now possess reports the destruction of Herculaneum of Pompeii and the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in AD 79, though Pliny the Younger gives a detailed account of the eruption itself. In fact, his uncle, Pliny the Elder, died in that eruption. But no one infers from Pliny's Silence that the event didn't take place. We know it did take place. And so, again, when we calibrate our expectations by looking at these counterexamples, we see why the argument from Silence is a weak form of argumentation. If you want to do a deep dive on this, there's an excellent paper published by Timothy McGrew, actually one of our team members at TalkAboutDoubts.com, on the argument from Silence, and he points out many of those counterexamples and why the argument from Silence is not a very good line of argument when it comes to historical inquiry. Here's some examples that he gives. So I'm getting these examples from Tim McGrew. I think there are good examples that illustrate the weakness of the argument from Silence. The existence of the works of Thucydides is not noted by any author whose works we now possess until some 250 years after they were written. Grafton's Chronicles, which embrace the reign of King John, make no reference to Magna Carta. In the extensive memoirs of Ulysses Grant, Lincoln's general during the American Civil War, there was no mention of the Emancipation Proclamation. Neither Herodotus nor Thucydides nor any of their contemporaries mentions Rome, even in passing, a point Josephus brings up in his controversy with Apion. In his sprawling travelogue, Marco Polo never refers to the Great Wall of China, or tea, or printed books. And so Tim McGrew concludes from these and other examples, at what point is it unreasonable for us, in the face of an avalanche of such examples, to retain our initial confidence regarding what ancient authors would have said? So let's now turn to the case against Luke. So the first objection we'll consider is in Luke 2, verse 1, where it says, in those days a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. Now, of course, this is probably talking about the Roman world, this is talking about the Roman world, the Roman Empire. So it's probably talking about an empire-wide census. And Bart Ehrman, in his book Jesus Interrupted, says we have relatively good records for the reign of Caesar Augustus, and there is no mention anywhere in any of them of an empire-wide census for which everyone had to register by returning to their ancestral home. How then do we answer the objection? Well, an empire-wide census is recorded in official Roman records, specifically in the deeds of the divine Augustus, which mentions censuses of between approximately 4 and 5 million citizens, indicating that these censuses were empire-wide. The census taking place just prior to the death of Herod the Great in 4 BC could have been the census of Augustus initiated in 8 BC, and registration records suggest that at times people were unable to respond to the census until the year following the initial issue date, meaning Joseph may not have arrived in Bethlehem for the census until the year after it was recorded by Augustus. Now, regarding Ehrman's objection about returning to their hometowns to be registered, we'll return to that in due course, so hold on to that thought. But let's turn to a second objection. This is a very famous one. In Luke chapter 2, verse 2, it says this was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria. But Quirinius didn't become governor of Syria until 86, some 10 years after Herod the Great was dead. So how can a chronological blunder of 10 or 12 years be explained? Well, Luke knows that Jesus was born during the reign of Herod the Great. So Luke 1 verse 5 tells us so. So this is important to bear in mind just before we actually attempt to address this objection, that Luke is aware that Jesus was born during the reign of Herod the Great, consistently with the other Gospels, because Luke explicitly tells us it was during the reign of Herod the Great. And furthermore, Luke also knows about the taxation under Quirinius in 86 because he mentions Gamaliel in Acts 5 verse 37, alluding to Judas the Galilean who rose up in the days of the census. And that was he led a revolt ensuing from that census in the taxation in 86. And so Luke is aware of that. And so any explanation of Luke's language in Luke 2 verses 1 and 2 must be compatible with these facts. Now, who was Quirinius then? Well, he was a Roman aristocrat. He lived from 51 BC to 21 AD, and he attained the rank of consul in 12 BC by the appointment of Caesar Augustus. But Caius Sentius Saturninus, a consul there, served as imperial legate of Syria province from 9 to 6 BC, when the 8 BC census of Augustus would have taken place. And Tertullian tells us that Sentius Saturninus did hold a census according to the orders of Augustus, that it took place in Judea, and it was relevant to the birth of Jesus. Now, what's the source of confusion then? So Josephus mentions Quirinius along with Coponius in Judea around 86, taking account of the substance of the province, taxing and spending the money left by Archelaus after his exile. And this is often incorrectly assumed to be the census that Luke has in mind. Now, while it's frequently supposed that Luke claims Quirinius was a Roman legate of Syria at this time, the term used, hegemonevo, can have a general meaning of ruling, commanding, or leading. And the word could refer to the legate of a province, such as the imperial province like Syria, but it's also the term used in Luke 3, verse 1 to describe the position of Pontius Pilate, who obviously was not a legate as prefect of Judea. And so the gospel account notes only that Quirinius was a ruler in Syria province who administered a Roman census around the time of the birth of Jesus. Now, while Quirinius was the legate of Syria province in 86, he was also in the area earlier functioning as a military commander. And actually, according to Roman records, Quirinius held a military command and placed him in the province of and around Cilicia, including the area of Syria province, and he was the leader of several legions in the area before eventually being appointed legatus procurator of Syria province as the former consul. You can read of that in Tacitus in his annals. Now, while commanding legions in Galatia, Cilicia, and Syria, Quirinius would have held a position of high authority in the Roman Empire, and his presence in these regions occurred sometime between 12 BC and 1 AD, but we're not exactly sure of the precise time and position because of the lack of detailed chronological information. So that places Quirinius in the area of Syria around the time that Jesus was born. And it may also be significant that when Saturninus was legate of Syria province, there were multiple governors, and that suggests that Quirinius, as indicated by Luke, could have been a ruler of Syria in 7 or 8 BC. And so a possible scenario is that Saturninus was the legate and Quirinius was the highest ranking military commander in Syria. And so why the Gospel of Luke mentions Quirinius in connection with the census instead of Saturninus is, I think, plausibly due to the function of Roman government. And Roman records show that military officials oversaw and administered censuses, and Quirinius is mentioned as a legate in the context of a census in Syria province during the reign of Caesar Augustus. So the solution then is, because it was Roman practice for military officials such as Quirinius to administer the census, it makes sense that Luke would associate Quirinius, the military commander, with the census instead of Saturninus, the governor. Let's then turn to a third objection, which is Luke 2, verses 3 and 4. It says, "And all went to be registered, each to his own town. And Joseph also went out from Galilee, from the town of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David." So Bart Ehrman objects. He says, are we to imagine that everyone in the Roman Empire was required to return to the homes of their ancestors from 1,000 years earlier? If we had a new worldwide census today, and each of us had to return to the towns of our ancestors 1,000 years back, where would you go? There is not a single reference to any such census in any ancient source apart from Luke. Well, let's read the text of Luke a little more carefully. It says, "In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria. And all went to be registered, each to his own town. And Joseph also went out from Galilee, from the town of Nazareth to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was the house and lineage of David." So notice it doesn't say that they were required to go back to the towns of their ancestors from 1,000 years earlier. Rather, it says each went to their own town to be registered. And the reason and Joseph went back to his hometown, namely Bethlehem, and he was from Bethlehem because he was of the house and lineage of David. So Joseph went to Bethlehem from Galilee because that was where his hometown was. So I think Bart Ehrman is overreading this text. And as for precedent for people being required to return to their hometowns for a census edict, census edict from Egypt province dating to 104 AD. This is British Museum Papyrus 904, says, and I quote, Gaius Vibius Maximus, prefect of Egypt, seeing that the time has come for the house-to-house census, it is necessary to compel all those who for any cause whatsoever are residing out of their provinces to return to their own homes, that they may both carry out the regular order of the census and may also attend diligently to the cultivation of their allotments. Let's go to a fourth objection. So in Luke 3, verse 1, it says, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea. Now, the objection here is that the term that Luke uses here is not the technical term for prefect. And before 44 AD, the governor of Judea was technically a prefect. But the more general term that Luke uses is, in fact, the common one. Josephus, the Jewish historian, repeatedly uses the term governor to describe Pilate and his predecessors in the same position. In fact, Tacitus, the Roman historian, describes Pontius Pilate as one of our procurators. Let's go to a fifth objection in Luke, also in Luke 3, verse 1. Herod being tetrarch of Galilee and his brother Philip, tetrarch of the region of Iturea and Trachonitis, and Lysanias, tetrarch of Abilene. But according to Josephus, Lysanias was tetrarch of Abila from about 40 to 36 BC, a full 60 years too early for the reference here. So what's going on? Well, the coincidence of the name Lysanias in the tetrarchy of Abila or Abilene does not mean that the one mentioned by Luke and the one mentioned by Josephus are the same person. These could be different individuals with the same name. Is there any evidence for this? Yes. An inscription found on a temple from the time of Tiberius, dating from 14 to 29 AD, names Lysanias as the tetrarch of Abila, just as Luke has written. Here's a temple inscription at Abila. It says, for the salvation of the august lords and of all their household, Nymphaeus, freedman of Eagle Lysanias Tetrarch, established this street, and other things. So what's the significance of the Abila inscription? Well, august lords is a joint title given only to the Emperor Tiberius and Livia, the widow of his predecessor Augustus. The title establishes the date of the inscription is between AD 14, the year that Augustus died, and Tiberius became sole emperor, and 29 AD, the year of Livia's death. And so there was, in fact, a different Lysanias who was tetrarch of Abilene right in the time Luke indicates. And so again, this was put forward as an objection to the Gospels, actually turns out to be a confirmation of the authors of the Gospels being very well informed and close up to the facts and knowledgeable about what was going on in the time of Jesus. Here's a sixth objection to Luke. This is from Luke 3, verse 2. It says, during the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas. Now, Robert Taylor objects, saying, any person being acquainted with the history and polity of the Jews must have known that there never was but one high priest at a time. So as Luke goofed up here, in fact, Matthew says the same thing. It says, then the chief priests, archreis, plural form, and the elders of the people gathered in the palace of the high priest, archreos, the singular form, whose name was Caiaphas. There's also a related issue in John, because according to John 11:49, it says, but one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, but wasn't the high priest supposed to be a lifelong occupation? As John made an error here. Well, how do we respond to these objections? Well, that Caiaphas was high priest, and high priest throughout the reign of Pontius Pilate, and consequently at this time appears in Josephus in his Antiquities, volume 18. Caiaphas was made high priest by the predecessor of Pontius Pilate, called Valerius Gratus, and he was removed from his office by Vitellius, president of Syria, after Pilate was sent away out of the province of Judea. So here's the text from Antiquities 18. It says, Gratus gave the high priesthood to Simon, son of Camathus. He, having enjoyed this honor not above a year, was succeeded by Joseph, who is called Caiaphas. Of the removal of Caiaphas from his office, Josephus likewise afterwards informs us and connects it with a circumstance which fixes the time to a date subsequent to the determination of Pilate's government. So here's quote, Vitellius, from Josephus, Vitellius ordered Pilate to repair to Rome, and after that went up himself to Jerusalem, and then gave directions concerning several matters. And having done these things, he took away the priesthood from the high priest Joseph, who is called Caiaphas. So Gratus, the predecessor of Pilate, in AD 16, deposed Ananus and stated a line of other high priests, one of whom was Joseph Caiaphas. And it looks like the Jews continued to recognize the Roman institution of high priest, in this case Caiaphas, but they also continued to recognize whom they considered to be the God-ordained high priest, who would be Ananus. And so they end up with two high priests, and that's actually something you see in Josephus as well, that they recognized two high priests at a time, and the Romans were constantly changing who the high priest was, and so forth. And so actually it fits in very neatly, very well with these historical circumstances at the time. So instead of being an objection to the gospel sources, is actually an argument that confirms their historicity. Let's look at the seventh objection. This is in Luke 7, verses 1 through 5. It says, after he had finished all his sayings in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. Now a centurion had a servant who was sick and at the point of death, who was highly valued by him. When the centurion heard about Jesus, he sent to him elders of the Jews, asking him to come and heal his servant. And when they came to Jesus, they pleaded with him earnestly, saying, he is worthy to have you do this for him, for he loves our nation, and he is the one who built us our synagogue. Now here's an objection that's put forward by Robert Price in his book, The Incredible Shrinking Son of Man. He says, a major collision between the gospel tradition and archaeology concerns the existence of synagogues and Pharisees in pre-70 CE Galilee. Historical logic implies that there would not have been any, since Pharisees fled to Galilee only after the fall of Jerusalem. Well, let's look at an archaeological report on excavations in Capernaum. We read, the first century Capernaum synagogue in which Jesus preached has probably been found. Because more than one synagogue may have existed in Capernaum at this time, we cannot be sure that this new find was Jesus' synagogue, but this recently discovered first century building is certainly a likely candidate. The conclusion that this was a first century AD synagogue seems inescapable. So Bob Price is simply incorrect on this matter. Here's an eighth objection to Luke. In Luke 17, verse 11, it says, on the way to Jerusalem, he was passing along between Samaria and Galilee. Now, Samaria lies between Galilee and Judea. So why would Jesus travel along the border between Samaria and Galilee in order to get to Jerusalem? Well, as we've talked about before, the Samaritans were actively hostile to the Jews. In fact, there's a section in Josephus where he talks about a murder of some pilgrims that had gone from Galilee, heading through Samaria to the feast in Jerusalem, because there were tensions between the Jews and the Samaritans over where one ought to worship. The Jews said you had to go to Jerusalem for the feasts. The Samaritans believed that you should worship on Mount Gerizim. And so as the Jews from Galilee passed through Samaria, it exacerbated those tensions. And so the Samaritans actually killed some Jewish pilgrims from Galilee on that particular occasion in AD 52. And in Luke 9:51 and following, some Samaritans refuse to welcome Jesus because they can see he intends to go to Jerusalem. So that's one reason why Jesus might have avoided Samaria. And furthermore, to travel east along the border would keep Jesus and his disciples near fresh water. So that's also an explanation for why he might have done so. So finally, then, let's turn to the case against John. So first objection is to John 1:28. It says, these things took place in Bethany across the Jordan where John was baptizing. But Bethany is located just 2 miles from Jerusalem on the Mount of Olives, not across the Jordan. So how do we answer the objection? Well, John's description is perfectly clear. It's referring to a Bethany beyond Jordan. 200 years after Jesus' death, the church father Origen tried to locate some of the geographical locations in Palestine. It's not surprising that he could not find them all. This provides no reason for doubting the accuracy of John's reference. John is much closer up to the facts than we are. Second objection is to John 9:22. His parents said these things because they feared the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that if anyone should confess Jesus to be the Christ, he was to be put out of the synagogue. And so an objection is that since our first record of an official Jewish exclusion of Christians from the synagogue dates to around AD 90, is this not an anachronism? Isn't this a serious chronological error? So So in accordance to Jewish tradition, sometime around 1890, Jewish leaders modified a congregational prayer to include an anathema on Nazarenes and heretics. But there's no reason to take John 9:22 as referring to this later modification of the prayer. The difficulty arises only from the assumption that John and the Jewish sources are referring to the same event. So in summary then, since we've taken these objections from the writings of skeptics, we have every reason to think that they represent the best criticisms at their disposal. And we have every reason on purely historical grounds to consider the Gospels to be substantially trustworthy historical documents written by authors who were well-informed and in the habit of being truthful. And I will finish there and happy to entertain any questions. Thanks so much for your attention.